The envelope was thick, the kind of official-looking notice you don't usually get unless something's gone terribly wrong. When I opened it and read the first few lines, I couldn't help but let out a short, humorless laugh. According to the Briar Ridge Lakeside Homeowners Association, I had exactly 48 hours to remove my boat from community waters or face a fine of $600, 0 cents per day. They even had the audacity to threaten towing at my expense. The tone was polished and cold, each sentence crafted like a velvet-gloved slap. But what made me chuckle wasn't the threat itself. It was the fact that the HOA had no clue they were trying to police property I had owned since I was a teenager. My name is Lucas Hart. I'm 38, a former cybersecurity consultant who spent the last 12 years working for defense contractors in D.C. When my tech startup was acquired in a quiet deal that padded my bank account more than I'd ever expected, I walked away. I didn't need more work or more noise. I needed space. That's how I ended up in Bluebird County, tucked away in a quiet cabin that overlooked a pristine, mirror-still lake I'd inherited from my grandfather. Harold Hart bought Windmere Lake in 1957, back when it was just a patch of wilderness and a place for trout to thrive. He'd been a conservationist and an old-school outdoorsman, someone who believed that the land could teach you everything you needed to know about yourself. He never trusted suits, permits, or developers. He trusted the water and his instinct. Growing up, I spent every summer there, morning fishing lessons, campfires under the stars, and long talks about nature, honesty, and grit. When he passed the lake and the cabin down to me at 20, I was too busy building my life to do much with it. But after burning out in D.C., I came back and never looked back. I'd only been living at Windmere full-time for a few months when the first sign of trouble appeared. Literally, a bright orange violation notice slapped to the side of my grandfather's aluminum fishing boat, which had been moored at the dock like it had been for decades. According to the paper, my boat was a visual nuisance and didn't meet the aesthetic standards set by the HOA. It was laughable. At first, I figured someone was confused. Maybe a new staffer didn't realize this part of the lake was privately owned. But then, I found the official notice in my mailbox, stamped, signed, and very serious. That's when I realized this wasn't a clerical error. This was a power play. What they didn't know, or chose to ignore, was that Windmere Lake was not a public amenity. The entire body of water, the shoreline, the dock, and even 15 feet of wooded land beyond the waterline, was mine, deeded, surveyed, and recorded. It had never been transferred, split, or annexed into the Briar Ridge development when it cropped up in the early 2000s. My grandfather had made damn sure of that. The HOA had no more legal right to regulate my lake than they did to regulate the moon. I made a call to my neighbor, Hank Jennings, who lived in a cabin a quarter-mile down the water. He was in his 70s, an ex-forest ranger who'd known my grandfather since they were young. Hank was one of the few folks around here I trusted. When I told him what happened, he let out a bark of laughter. "Let me guess," he said. "HOA wants you to hide the boat because it doesn't fit the lake house aesthetic." "They tried that with my woodshed 3 years ago," Hank said. "Told me it was a fire hazard. I told them the only hazard was them breathing too much smug air. You gotta watch out for Susan Harper. She's the president now. Came in with her city hair and her money and thinks she runs the valley." I told him I'd look into it, and he warned me of something else. The Briar Ridge Elite Anglers Club. I'd never heard of them. Apparently, they'd been hosting exclusive fishing tournaments on Windmere for years. I blinked. "They've been using my lake?" "Like it's their private resort," Hank confirmed. and making plenty off it too. Sponsorships, entry fees, catered events. Your granddad would have chased him off with a rifle if he were still around. I spent that night deep diving the HOA's community page, and sure enough, there it was. Page after page of glossy photos from their annual fishing events. Tents lined up on my eastern shore, boats tied to a makeshift dock, signs boasting Briar Ridge's crown jewel. They had no idea the lake wasn't theirs. Or worse, they did and figured no one would call them on it. That was their mistake. The next day, I contacted Ava Moreno, a friend from college who now worked as a real estate and environmental attorney. When I laid it all out for her, my ownership of the lake, the trespassing, the false HOA claims, she practically jumped through the phone. "Lucas," she said, "you don't just have a solid case, you have a flamethrower. Don't reply to anything just yet. Let's gather evidence, map out your boundaries, and get the paperwork airtight. Trust me, we're going to bury them in their own arrogance." So I didn't respond to the notice. Not yet. Instead, I installed high-res cameras along my property. I pulled up old records and deeds, some signed in my grandfather's own weathered handwriting. And while I waited for Ava to make the trip out from the city, I watched as people who didn't own a single grain of sand on that lake continued to treat it like their private playground, watched as strangers held wine-tasting picnics on my dock, watched as HOA board members pulled up in golf carts to inspect the shoreline with clipboards in hand. They thought they could bully me into silence. They didn't realize they just picked a fight with the one person on this lake who had nothing to lose and everything on paper. The cabin creaked gently as I sat by the window, a mug of black coffee warming my palms, watching dawn unfurl over Sullivan Lake like a slow exhale. Mist floated low on the water, a ghostly veil that blurred the shoreline and made the world feel smaller, more intimate. It was the kind of morning that made time loosen its grip. The kind of morning my grandfather used to say was made for thinking. But that day, my thoughts were anything but serene. The HOA's absurd demand still sat on my desk, neon orange violation notice flapping faintly with each breeze that slipped through the open window. "Remove the boat," it said, community visual standards, as if my grandfather's old fishing vessel, seasoned, loyal, quiet as the lake itself, was some eyesore threatening their manicured reality. I knew then that this wasn't just about a boat. It was about territory, about power, about rewriting a story that my family had been telling on this land for 70 years. Ray Delgado's call had come as both a warning and a validation. If there was anyone who remembered what this place used to be, before the luxury vinyl siding, before the HOA boardroom politics, it was Ray. And hearing that they'd been holding tournaments, building docks, and pitching barbecues on our land wasn't just insulting. It was theft, sanctified by time and silence. I wasn't interested in confrontation for its own sake. After years in tech, where the loudest voice often drowned out the smartest one, I had finally rediscovered peace. But if there was one thing I'd learned from my startup years, it was that you never let a competitor define your narrative, especially not when they're building it on your foundation. The sun rose higher, slicing through the mist and igniting the lake's surface with a golden sheen. That's when I began to plan. Quietly, precisely, the way engineers and fishermen do. The first step was clarity. I needed to see the full picture. I started with a paper trail, digging through old filing cabinets in the cabin study, dust catching in the light like ancient secrets. My father had kept everything: deeds, surveys, correspondence, even old Polaroids of my grandfather holding up fish with the lake shimmering behind him like a blessing. I found a 2010 property map with detailed boundary markings that left no room for interpretation. The lake and a generous strip of its shoreline belonged solely to the Sullivan family, legally, irrefutably. And yet these people, these HOA suits with their weekend blazers and artificially white smiles, had dared to claim it as community property. That night I couldn't sleep. So I did what I always did when the world made less sense than usual. I took the boat out. The hull nudged through the water like a memory resurfacing. Mid-lake, I killed the motor, lay back, and let the stars fill my vision. Somewhere beneath me, the lake's original silence stirred. Deeper than noise, older than dispute. I thought of my grandfather's words. Water is life, Jake. And life's not something you lease on a whim. I realized then, this wasn't just about protecting a boundary, it was about defending a legacy. By morning, I had a plan. I called Emma Porter. Emma had always possessed the kind of mind that cut through lies like a knife through silk. She'd gone into environmental law while I'd chased tech, and yet we'd stayed in touch. Mostly holiday calls and mutual birthday texts, until now. Her laugh when I told her what was happening was half incredulous, half delighted. "Jake," she said, "they have no idea who they're messing with." We agreed she'd come up that weekend to review everything. Until then, I set up a network of discrete, motion-selected cameras along the lake's east shore, where the elite anglers had been holding their tournaments. The feeds went directly to my phone, clear as day, even in low light. It wasn't paranoia. It was documentation. The kind of proof no court, board, or club could ignore. The real kicker came later that day when I found the Maple Creek Estates website. There, in bold, self-congratulatory font, was a feature on their 15th annual Lakeside Fishing Derby, complete with photos of catered buffets, branded club tents, and boats anchored in my water. Not a mention of Sullivan ownership. They called it the jewel of the community. My grandfather had called it sacred. The juxtaposition was infuriating, but also empowering. Because what they'd done, in their ignorance, in their entitlement, was give me exactly what I needed. Their own admission, dozens of photos, dates, names, proof. The next day, I received an automated email from the HOA, a generic invitation to their upcoming monthly meeting. I stared at it for a long time before clicking RSVP. Sometimes the first move in a checkmate isn't a bold strike, it's a quiet presence. A reminder that the board doesn't belong to your opponent alone. I wasn't going to yell, I wasn't going to threaten. I was going to show up, calm, prepared, and entirely within my rights. And when I did, I was going to let them know the lake has a memory, and so do the people who love it. You don't get to erase either without a fight. The night before the HOA meeting, I sat alone at the dining table with the old survey map stretched out in front of me, the weight of generations pressing against the grain of the wood. Outside, wind whispered across the lake's surface, but I barely heard it. I was too focused on rehearsing the questions I'd ask. Not confrontational, not accusatory, just clear, deliberate, impossible to sidestep. At precisely 6:47 p.m., I stepped into the Maple Creek Estates Community Center. The interior was what you'd expect from a place designed to look more impressive than it was. Faux columns, polished laminate floors pretending to be hardwood, fluorescent lights buzzing like old secrets, a table of stale cookies and lukewarm coffee tried to pass for hospitality. I took a seat in the back and watched the room fill with homeowners, mostly couples in pastel polos and khakis, chatting about sprinklers and dog leashes. Then came Richard Wilkins. He entered with the poise of a man who had mistaken his HOA presidency for a divine appointment. His silver hair was coiffed to perfection, his blue blazer sharp and smug. Karen Mitchell, the vice president, followed close behind, clipboard clutched like a holy relic. Neither of them noticed me. Not yet. Richard began the meeting like he was running for something. "Let's keep Maple Creek the gem it's always been," he said, as if he were guarding the gates of paradise from weeds and unsightly mailbox paint. The room nodded along, lulled by his voice, until he said the word lake. I leaned forward. "We've had reports," he announced, voice turning grave, "of an unauthorized vessel moored on community waters. I'd like to remind residents that all boats must be registered and comply with our visual standards." The room barely stirred. This was routine. Until I raised my hand. Richard blinked. "Yes, the gentleman in the back?" I stood slowly, kept my voice steady. "Could you clarify who owns the lake?" The silence sharpened. Karen's eyes flicked toward me, calculating. A few neighbors turned in their seats. Richard's smile faltered for half a breath. Then he recovered. "The lake," he said smoothly, "is managed by the HOA as part of our broader stewardship of community resources." "Managed," I echoed. "But do you own it? Or does the HOA hold a deed? Or is it public land administered by agreement?" A murmur passed through the room like a slow wave. Richard's face tightened, the way a man's jaw tightens when he knows the floor beneath him might be cracking. "There are historical arrangements in place," he said finally, "but let's not get lost in technicalities. What matters is preserving the beauty of our shared environment." I nodded like I agreed. "Absolutely. I was just curious. Because I'm Jake Sullivan. And I recently moved into the old lake cabin. My family's owned Sullivan Lake since 1953. A pause. Then whispers. I saw the recognition dawn on some faces. Others just looked confused. Richard's smile now looked more like a grimace. "Well, welcome, Mr. Sullivan. I hope you'll work with us to keep the area up to standard." "Oh, I intend to," I said, sitting back down. "Very much so." The meeting lurched forward, but the air had shifted. I watched Richard exchange glances with Karen and, later, with a man I hadn't noticed before, Gerald Thompson. Mid-60s, tanned face, branded fishing vest, the self-satisfaction of a man used to being the loudest voice on the dock. He approached me afterward, smile tight. "Haven't seen you around before," he said. "Must be new to the area." "I'm Jake," I said, offering a hand. "Just moved into the old Sullivan place." His grip hesitated, then tightened. "That place, huh? We thought it was abandoned. Guess we were wrong." I smiled. "You were, and I've been learning some interesting things about the lake since I got back. Seems like your fishing club's been busy." He didn't flinch. "Elite anglers. Very exclusive, but maybe we can get you in. We've got a big tournament next weekend, biggest event of the year. You should stop by." "I just might," I said, already deciding I'd be there. With cameras. As I turned to leave, I passed the refreshment table and caught a voice. Richard's lowered but urgent. "We need to move the timeline up. Sullivan's asking questions." Then Karen's voice, sharp and hushed. "Before it's too late." They didn't see me, but I saw them, and I knew. This wasn't just a territorial scuffle. It was strategy. These people weren't just protecting a club or a rule book. They were protecting a plan. Outside, in the cool night air, I called Emma. "They're hiding something," I said. "Something big." She didn't hesitate. Then we find it. Whatever this is, Jake, we end it on our terms. Back at the cabin, I watched the reflection of stars on the lake's still surface. The same stars my grandfather watched decades ago, from the same dock, holding the same railing. And I knew this wasn't just about me. It never was. It was about legacy, truth, and the simple, stubborn belief that you don't get to lie your way into power on someone else's land. The morning after the meeting, I was greeted by the kind of silence that only arrives before a storm. It hung in the air like static, thick with a sense that something or someone was about to overstep. And by noon, that something had arrived. My boat was gone. I walked out onto the dock, coffee mug still warm in my hand, and for a second, I thought maybe I'd forgotten to tie it properly. Maybe the wind had pulled it loose in the night. But there were no drag marks, no signs of struggle, just a neatly folded notice taped to the dock post like some bureaucratic calling card. HOA, citation, non-4740, 127. Unauthorized vessel removed for non-compliance. It had all the cold confidence of a thief who thinks he has the law on his side. I didn't curse, didn't throw my mug. I just stood there, listening to the lap of water against the wood, and let the anger settle into something colder, sharper. They'd made the first real move. Inside, I sat down at the dining table, the same spot where I'd once done homework as a boy, where my grandfather had cleaned fish and sharpened knives, and pulled out the documents Emma had helped me organize. The deed, the survey, the county filings. Every page said the same thing. The lake was mine, and the HOA had just stolen private property. When I called the sheriff's office, the dispatcher on the other end sounded polite but uncomfortable. "These HOA cases can get messy," he said. "It's best if you resolve it through civil channels. You might consider reaching out to their legal team directly." Legal team. That made me smile, bitterly, as if a borrowed sense of authority could erase the ink on a 70-year-old deed, as if compliance agreements and laminated violations could unwrite history. By the time Emma arrived that afternoon, the fire behind my eyes had turned to a steady burn. She took one look at the citation, then at the empty dock, and her jaw tightened. "They're trying to force you to acknowledge their authority," she said. "But this is theft. They're not playing HOA anymore. They're playing developer." She was right, of course. This wasn't about a boat. It never was. The tournament, the secrecy, the evasive answers at the meeting, it was all part of a larger game, one designed to create precedent. A fiction. One quiet enough that no one would notice until it was too late. And I had walked right into their timeline. That evening, as the sun turned the lake to molten gold, Emma and I laid out every piece of paper across the dining table. We pored over zoning laws, land grants, HOA bylaws. She found language in the original Maple Creek Estates development application that made my blood run cold. In small, sanitized print, it referenced adjacent bodies of water, historically unmanaged, available for community beautification and shared recreational use, contingent on future negotiations, the kind that assumed the other party never shows up. "They've been planning this for years," Emma said, "waiting for you not to come back. And now that you're here, they're trying to railroad you into giving up legal control by pretending it doesn't exist." I said nothing. I didn't need to, because every memory of my grandfather teaching me to cast a line from that boat, every story told over the crackle of the fire pit, every hard-earned blister from clearing brush or replacing a rotting beam on the dock, they were speaking for me now. That night, while Emma reviewed the county filings, I pulled up the footage from the motion-sensitive security cameras I'd installed earlier that week. The Eastern Shore, the site of the so-called Elite Anglers Championship, was already seeing traffic. Trucks, tents, even a makeshift dock going up. But what caught my attention wasn't the fishermen. It was the men in suits. 3 of them, clean-cut, clipboard types walking the shore with Gerald Thompson, pointing at trees, measuring distances, nodding like they were already drawing blueprints in the air. One of them held what looked like architectural renderings, and another took a call while gesturing toward my cabin. I didn't need sound to know what was being said. This is where the private marina goes. Emma stood behind me, arms crossed, watching the screen. They're showing investors. They've convinced people they have control. I looked at her. Then, it's time we show them who really does. We didn't go to war the next day. We went to work. Emma drafted a carefully worded letter to the HOA's attorney, requesting, not demanding, copies of any documentation they claimed gave them jurisdiction over Sullivan Lake. She asked for meeting minutes, usage agreements, event permits. "Let's make them squirm," she said, sliding the envelope into the mailbox. "If they don't respond, we expose them. If they do, we pick it apart line by line." Meanwhile, I contacted Sarah Lynn, the local journalist Ray had recommended. She'd written a column last year about a different HOA scandal. Misuse of landscaping funds for a board member's personal pool. She was smart, sharp, and skeptical in all the right ways. We met at a diner off the main road. Neutral ground. Over coffee and stale pie, I showed her everything. The photos, the footage, the deeds, the court maps. Her eyes lit up. "They're hosting public events on your private property," she said. "Planning a resort? Without even owning the lake? This is huge." "I need a little time before it goes public," I said. "But if things escalate, I want people to know the truth." "You'll have it," she promised, already scribbling notes. The calm before the storm lasted exactly 5 days. On the 6th, Richard Wilkins showed up at my door. Gone was the confident smile from the HOA meeting. He looked tired, almost conciliatory. A handshake too soft, a blazer traded for business casual, as if trying to seem more human. "Mr. Sullivan," he began, "I think we may have gotten off on the wrong foot." And as he sat in my living room, sipping my coffee and offering vague overtures of compromise, I realized something. They weren't just afraid of losing the lake. They were afraid of me. Because I had what they didn't. The truth, the title, and something they couldn't buy or threaten into silence. A legacy worth defending. As the sun dipped below the trees and shadows stretched across the wooden floorboards of the cabin, I gave Richard a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "I'll think about it," I said. But we both knew I already had. And so, the lake is quiet again. Not because it belongs to just one man, but because the truth finally drowned out the lies. What started with a single absurd notice on my grandfather's old boat turned into something much bigger, a reckoning. A reminder that entitlement, no matter how well-dressed, cannot erase ownership, history, or legacy. The lesson here isn't just about land rights or HOA overreach. It's about knowing when to stand up, when to listen, and when to act. Because sometimes the biggest theft isn't of property. It's of voice, dignity, and heritage. And the only way to take it back is through clarity, community, and courage. That lake didn't need fences. It needed boundaries. It didn't need silence. It needed someone willing to speak up. And maybe, just maybe, it needed someone like you. So the next time you feel small, unheard, or outnumbered, remember this story. Because when one man stood for his family's lake, an entire community rediscovered what it meant to protect something real. Now I turn it to you. If you found this story satisfying or inspiring, comment Film1 Ben Duoy. Nu Ben Chuate video duabdan. Hey, nahan fed zero de trois biet bataiti non wow kakao chuen tiptio. Your voice matters. Justice, like water, always finds its way.